In Lesson 4, we're going to begin building our customer table. We'll see how to create a new table. We'll learn about field names and naming conventions. We'll learn about the different data types that are available. And we'll start building the customer table. Now that we know our way around the Access interface, let's build our first table. Now, one thing I'm going to mention, I just switched computers. My other computer was a brand new one that I wanted to use for starting up a blank brand new database to show you what it looks like on a new system. I just switched over to my other computer because this is the one I normally record my classes on, so I just don't want anybody freaking out if you see that the file name up here is different, okay? Everything else is exactly the same. Don't worry about it. Okay, now let's go back to our index cards. Find the card for your customer table. These are all the fields we're going to add to the customer table in our database. First name, last name, address, and so on. Now, Access gives you multiple ways to do pretty much everything. Just like in Word and Excel, there's 5 ways to do pretty much anything you can think of. There are multiple ways to create a new table. Click on the Create tab, and you'll see Table, Table Design, and SharePoint Lists. Don't worry about SharePoint lists. That's for working with online databases. I've got whole seminars and classes for SharePoint stuff. We'll worry about that later. For now, there's Table and Table Design. Now, the first option here, Table, puts you into Datasheet view. Now, this is where Access started us when we first started to create the database. Remember that? Now, Datasheet view lets you type in the data first and then define the tables afterwards, kind of like a spreadsheet. You could type in Joe, tab, Smith, tab, New York, and so on, right? Just like you're working with Excel. Now, personally, I find this backwards when it comes to developing databases. I think one of the strong points of Access is you define the table first. You specify exactly what type of data each field is going to contain. Then you add data to it afterwards. So I don't like this method. I'm going to close this table, and when Access says, do you want to save changes? I'm going to say no. Go away. We don't want that. So we're going to create a table the right way. Click on Create and then Table Design. This puts us right into design mode. Now, Design View lets you specify the field names, like first name, last name, and so on, the data types, text, number, currency, that kind of stuff. And then once you're done defining the table structure, then you can go back and add your data to it. It's better to build the structure first, then add the data. One of the problems with Excel, for example, is anybody can come in here and just type in anything they want, wherever they want, right? Put Joe there, put Smith over here, right? I mean, yeah, you can set up some kind of basic validation and some structure in here, but an Access database is what you want to use to make your users conform to the style and the types of data that you want them to be typing in to each field. Sometimes you want a random notepad to be able to come over here and type stuff in, okay? I get it. Excel has its purposes. But Access is what you want to use for structured data entry. With Access, you force your users to type in the data types that you want. They can't type in text, for example, in a currency field. If you want a date, Access makes sure they give you a date. Now, when constructing a table, there's 2 types of information that you have to have, and an optional third one. You have to have the field name, the data type, and optionally a description. The field name describes the kind of information that you're storing. First name, last name, address, city, state, all that. Those are field names. Then the data type describes what kind of information that field is going to hold. Text, number, currency, date, and lots more. If you make the data type a number field, then the user can't type something like blue in there. All right? They have to put a number in. And later on, we'll get to something called validation rules, where you can say it's got to be a number between 10 and 100. And finally, you can type in an optional description if you want to. This is usually to explain what an ambiguous field might be to a user who doesn't know your database. For example, you might have a field called isActive. And you know that means it's an active customer, they buy from you regularly, they're on your mailing list, that kind of stuff. Someone else, a new employee, might look at that field and go, what does that mean? This guy likes to exercise, he's active, right? So that can tell the user in the description field what that means. And if you type in something in the description field, it will show up down in the status bar when they're entering data in. So let's start by putting in our first field. Come right over here, and in the field name column, type in first name. No spaces, capital F, capital N, and then press Tab. Now remember, this is just my personal naming convention, but if you're going to be learning from me, I strongly suggest you follow it too. It's good. I've been doing this for almost 30 years now, and it works. I don't like to put spaces in my field names, my table names, my query names, my form names. Okay? Trust me, when you get into more advanced stuff, macros and modules and VBA programming, you're going to thank me. So this is what I usually do. I do capital first, no space, capital N, name, right? Nice and easy. Very popular with Visual Basic programmers. Now, if you already have been building Access databases for a little while and you've got some spaces in your field names, that's okay. You can still work with them. Access will allow it. But now, you've got to remember to put square brackets around your field names if you use them in queries, Visual Basic, SQL. Okay? Once you start getting into more advanced stuff, you're going to thank me and wish you didn't have spaces in your field names or your table names. In fact, if you are just getting started and you've got some other databases that you've been working on that have spaces in them, you might want to go back now and get rid of those spaces. Trust me. Now, Access is not case sensitive. So all lowercase first name, all uppercase first name, Access doesn't care. All lowercase or all uppercase, it's okay. It's a little more difficult to read, especially when you get into programming. And if you do decide to get into the more advanced stuff like the VB programming, if you have mixed cases in your field names and your variable names and stuff, if you type them in all lowercase, Access will capitalize them for you. And that's a quick way that you can see that you type something in wrong. That's a trick that I'll get into in my developer classes. So trust me, type in your variable names like this, your field names. Okay? You'll thank me later. You might see some programmers, some databases use that, the underscore. That's perfectly fine too. I used to be a C programmer years ago, and in C, that's how you do all your variable declarations, right? First underscore name. That's okay. Again, I like my method better. You can use a hyphen in your field name if you really want to, but again, I don't recommend it. I don't recommend using any non-letter or number characters in your table names or field names. That can be confused with subtraction sometimes. So again, stick to that. Trust me. Just try to keep it to letters and numbers. Don't use question marks. Don't use dashes. Okay? You may see some other developers or book authors use this kind of notation. This is called Hungarian notation. It's basically the first name field with a prefix on the front to tell you what kind of information first name is, if it's text, for example. I personally don't bother with this because most of my field names are self-explanatory. I usually know that first name, last name, those are text values, right? Credit limit's a currency amount. Number of children's a numeric value. If you're working in large teams of developers, you might want to do that. But generally, sole developers, I don't ever bother. And like I said, I've been building Access databases for almost 30 years, and my naming convention works pretty good. The important thing is to maintain consistency. Stick with one style of naming your fields and your tables and such. There are some reserved words that Access has that you should avoid using for your field names. For example, name, date, left, picture. Those are all either property names or function names. Don't make a field called name, for example. Use first name or last name. Don't have an order date be just date. Okay, date has special meaning in Access. I've got a page on my website with all of the reserved words on it. I'll put a link in the description down below the video if you want to check that out. There's a lot of them, so I'm not going to put them here in the video, but go check that page out. You'll see the big long list. Usually, if you try to keep your field names compound, like more than one word, like first name, order, date, you're safe. You're okay. Right? Use profile picture or left junction or something like that. Try to be as descriptive as you can without going overboard. Usually 2 words works perfectly for a field name or a table name. Okay, so I put in my field name, first name. Now I'm over in the data type column. The default option for the data type is short text. If you drop down this combo box, you'll see the complete list of all of the data types available in Access. The first data type is short text. It's the most popular one. You're going to use it most of the time. Short text includes pretty much all of the printable characters on the keyboard. A through Z, upper lowercase, 0 through 9, exclamation point, ampersand, all that stuff. These can be anywhere from 1 to 255 characters long. So you can use a short text field to store most types of data, names, addresses, all that stuff. If you happen to be using an older version of Access from 2010 or earlier, this used to be called just text. They used to have text and memo, and they changed it in 2013 to short text and long text. So if you hear me refer to something as a text field, I mean short text. And if I say memo, I mean long text. What is long text, you ask? Well, good question. Short text fields can only be up to 255 characters long. Long text fields can be 65,000 plus characters long. You can store a lot of information in a long text field. Long text fields also support formatting, so you can have rich text with colors and bold, italics, all that stuff. In fact, in some of our later lessons, we're going to see how to make a letter writer, where we can actually type up a letter just like you would in Microsoft Word, but it's all stored inside the database. Then you can hit print, print it out, and it looks just like a Word document. That will be using formatted long text. Now, long text fields used to be called memo fields in the older versions of Access, so if you hear me say a memo field, I'm talking about long text. Now, at this point, a lot of people ask me, why not just use long text for everything if it's so much better? Well, short text has some benefits. In fact, I made a 15-minute video that I put on my website and on YouTube that just goes over the differences between short text and long text and why you'd want to use each one. So if you're really curious, I'll put a link to that video down below in the description field. See, this is why it's really nice that I've been doing this for so many years, because I've got videos to explain all kinds of other stuff, and I can point you in that direction if you want to know right now, instead of saying, we'll cover it in a future class. I've already covered it. Go watch that video if you really want to know. The bottom line is, if it's a normal bit of information, like a name, an address, a social security number, something like that, a small bit of information, use a short text field. If you don't know how much information you're going to be typing in, you could be typing in lots and lots of notes, use long text. Why specifically? Go see that video. If you're going to be typing in directions to get to a customer's house, or information about a service call, or like I said before, the letter writer, use long text. Everything else, short text. Short text fields are much, much more efficient when it comes to searching and sorting. If you have a big long list of customers, for example, and you want to sort them by last name, short text is much more efficient. Next, you'll see there are number type fields. All right, you got your text, short text, long text. Next, we got numbers. And there's a whole bunch of different kinds of numbers, but there are two that we're going to focus on for beginners. There's long integers and doubles. We're going to use long integers for any kind of a counting number. 1, 2, 3, 0, -16, okay? Integer type numbers. Doubles are what we're going to use to store floating point numbers, anything with a decimal. How many gallons of gas did you put in your car? 10.5, that's 10.5. We're going to put it in a double. How many children do you have? 5, that's a long integer, okay? Two types of numbers I want you to focus on. Yeah, there's a whole bunch of other ones. There's byte, there's integer, there's single, there's decimal. Don't worry about all those for now. In future classes, I'll go over all the little nuances between them. But for right now, long integers for counting numbers, integers basically, doubles for floating points. Now, one thing to take into consideration when you're planning your database is, should the field be a number or text? My rule of thumb is, if you're ever going to perform calculations on it, use a number. If not, store it as text. Text is much easier to work with. For example, social security number. Okay, for us in the United States here. Store it as text. Yes, it says number, and yes, it's always numeric, but it's easier to work with as text. You're never going to be adding up a column of social security numbers. You're never going to be finding the average of a bunch of social security numbers, right? And sometimes they start with 0, so we don't have to want to deal with that 0 falling off. Store it as text. Zip codes. Yeah, they're all numbers. Store them as text. They're easier to work with. You're not going to be figuring out the largest zip code or the average of a bunch of zip codes, right? Store it as text. Keep in mind that if you're working with old school systems, right, old databases, people using paper systems, they might have something called a part number, but it's not a number. The part number might be PT463G. That's not a number. That's text. All right, so keep that in mind. Access has something called a DateTime Field. A DateTime field can store a date or a time or both. So you can store just a date, January 1st, 1980, or just a time, 4:55 p.m., or both at the same time, January 1st, 1980 at 4:55 p.m. You can be as specific as you want. Access has a special kind of numeric value called currency. Use currency fields for dealing with money. Currency is a special type of floating point number that's optimized for dealing with currency. Okay, so use currency values for money. I'll explain the specifics a little bit later. One nice thing about currency is it will observe the regional settings on your computer. So if you're in a different country, I'm here in the United States. All right, if you're in Europe, it'll use euros, for example, okay, or whatever your country's currency is. Next up, we have the yes/no data type, also true, false, on, off. These are called Boolean values, right? Yes or no. Next, we have a very important data type called AutoNumber. I make sure there's an AutoNumber in pretty much every table that I build. AutoNumbers are going to start at 1, and then every time you add another record, it's going to increment that number. So each record has a unique identifier. Customer 1, customer 2, customer 3. No one's got the same AutoNumber. Later on, when we create relationships between our multiple tables, this is how we will track which customer belongs to an order, for example, because we'll store the customer ID in the order table. Access maintains these numbers for you. You don't have to worry about them. You don't even have to see them if you don't want to. They're stored in the table, and they're used internally for Microsoft Access to make relationships. Now, I sometimes get into arguments with other developers who don't like AutoNumbers. I put a whole huge video together on why I like AutoNumbers. If you care, I'll put a link down in the description below the video. Go watch it if you want to. It's a good reasons why I like to use AutoNumbers in almost every one of my tables. Next up are two data types that I try to recommend people don't use. Ole Object stands for Object Linking and Embedding. These are pictures, documents, videos, anything you can copy and paste, you can store in an Ole Object. You can copy a whole Word document or an Excel spreadsheet or a PDF file, and you could paste it into a table inside your Access database. Just like the attachment data type, you could take whole files and save them inside your database. The problem with these two methods, with these two data types, is that they make your database big and bloated and slow, and it doesn't work right if you got lots of attachments inside of it. So yes, I am going to show you eventually how to use both of these because they do have their place. I'm not saying they're 100% evil, but I'm also going to show you better ways to manage working with files and pictures than using these two data types. People always ask me, that's why I'm mentioning them, but we'll get to these eventually. Next up, you'll see the hyperlink data type. This is good for storing web pages and email addresses because if you click on it, it will load up your web browser or your email program. Personally, I like hyperlinks for storing web addresses. I don't like hyperlinks for storing email addresses. For web pages, it's nice because you can click on the web link and it loads up your web browser. For email addresses, it gets hard working with email addresses. I'd rather store them as short text, and I will show you a way in the more advanced classes on how we can send an email from Access. Don't use the hyperlink data type for email addresses, and we'll talk about this when we get to email. Next up is the calculated field type. I don't like storing calculations in my tables. As a general rule of thumb, if you have to do a calculation, do it in a query. There are some exceptions, and I will talk about this in a future class. Remember, we had this conversation earlier, okay? But if you see calculated field types, don't use them, okay? Trust me. Microsoft added the calculated field type to tables to make it easier for beginner users to do calculations like sale price minus unit cost equals profit. But that's more properly and better done in a query. Calculated fields can cause trouble later on. Next up, you'll see the Lookup Wizard. Lookup Wizard is an evil wizard, right? Are you a good witch or a bad witch? Well, the Lookup Wizard is a bad witch. Don't use them. What is the Lookup Wizard? Well, again, Microsoft wanted to give beginner users the ability to look up a value from a list. Okay, you want to pick a state from a list of states, New York, Pennsylvania, Texas, whatever. Okay, put it in the Lookup Wizard, and that goes right in your table. But it violates the normal database rules of normalization. You don't want to use them. Trust me, when you get into anything but the most basic of databases, Lookup Wizards are a nightmare to work with. Please don't use them. And if you have them in your existing databases, get rid of them. I'll show you how to get rid of them when we get into the expert classes, when we start working with relational combo boxes. If you're a new Access user, if this is your first time using Access, trust me, don't use the lookup wizards. Okay, so now that we've gotten a basic overview of all the different types of data types, the types of data types, say that 10 times fast. Which one do you think works best for first name? That's going to be text, right? Short text or long text? I don't know too many first names that are longer than 255 characters. So, short text. All right, and then we'll hit tab. Now, if you want to type in a description, you can. Personally, I almost never use descriptions. Very, very rarely, okay? If I know I'm building a database for someone who has no computer skill and the field name is confusing, then maybe I'll put a description in there. But I almost never do. Unless I'm building a really complicated table for myself later on and I want to remind myself what this field is for, then sometimes I'll use that. But generally, no. So just hit tab. If you decide you want them later, you can always come back and put them in later. If you're working in a team with other developers or multiple people in your office that are designing the database, you may want to rely on the description fields a little more to explain to your teammates what some of these fields are. One of the most difficult things as a database consultant myself to work with is when I get a database from a client and they want me to fix it or add something to it, and I have no idea what some of their field names are. So the description can help me sometimes to understand what they've done, but I find that most people don't use them anyway, so it's like I have to call them up and say, hey, what does this field mean? Okay, next field, last name. Remember, no space, capital N, short text, tab, tab, done. Nice and quick once you get the hang of it, right? Now, do you want middle name, middle initial, prefix, suffix, title, all that stuff? That's completely up to you. That's one of the benefits of building your own database with Access, is you can decide what's important and what's not important for your database. I built databases for customers where they really only wanted one field name for the customer's name because it wasn't important. And I built databases for mailing list customers where they wanted everything. Prefix, suffix, title, middle name, all that stuff. Okay? You decide. One of the nice things about the short text field is that you can specify a limit on the size. Down here where you see field size 255, by default they start off at 255 characters. That's the biggest possible. If you want to limit that to only one character or 5 characters for a zip code, for example, you can change that and make it smaller. We'll talk more about field sizes a little bit later on. You can't do that with a long text field. People can type in as much as they want. So for the purposes of class, I'm going to go with just first name and last name, which honestly is all I use in my database. All right, my company database, I just got first name and last name. I don't care about all the rest of it. Honestly, I really only care about first name and email address. It's an internet business, right? I call people by their first name when I'm addressing them in an email. Last name, need it for credit card validation, but that's about it. How about the customer's address? And that's a short text field as well. Now, I personally have always been happy with just one address field. A lot of my clients like 2, address 1, address 2. They like to put the suite number or apartment number in the address 2 field. That's fine. If that's what you want, build it that way. You can put line breaks inside of a short text field. So you can type in part of the address, hit the line break, shift enter or control enter, and it will give you a second line in the address field if you want that. And I've had customers who have wanted to break the address field up into the number on the street name, the type, whether it's a drive, an avenue. So again, the benefit of building it in Access is you can make it as specific as you want to. For me, just address. Let's finish this up with city, state, and zip. If you're in a different country, you might want to use postal code or whatever you have for your region. I'm in the United States, so I'm going to use U.S. addresses here. If you do business internationally, you might want to add country. That's fine. If you're in Canada, change state to province, whatever you want to call it. And what I do for country is most of my customers are here in the United States, but I've got customers in pretty much every country of the world. But I'll leave country blank for U.S. customers. That's just how I do it. You obviously would probably want to make your country blank for your home country. Now, so far, we've only used text data types. In the next lesson, we're going to add some additional fields to this table, and we're going to start talking about some of the other data types.